Okay, yeah. So the name of the class this morning is The Coming Great Displacement, Migration in a Heating World. And one of the things that I think is important about this topic is that obviously global climate change, we've talked about that in several classes over the past couple of years, about some of the very serious effects it's going to have on small farmers, on agricultural production, and we've mentioned in passing that it's probably going to create what's known as climate refugees. People are going to move. But there's recently, the UN recently released a very somber, I guess you could say, report discussing the numbers, the statistics behind the amount of climate refugees that are expected in the next 25 years as climate change really starts to take place, as sea level starts to rise, as certain parts of the world become too hot for human communities to really survive, as agricultural regions start to fail. All of these things are going to push enormous amounts of people to migrate, both internally and externally, both within their countries and outside of their countries. And as a person who's lived for the past 20 years in a country that has been drastically affected by migration, both in a way that one of the things I think is unfortunate in the debate about migration is that there are those people who talk about the right of the migrants, right? How people on the move are human beings, they have a right to dignity, to right treatment. Then there's the people in the receiving countries, and there's all the pushback. Right now, you see a fairly large kind of right-wing nationalist movement, both in North America, in Europe, in parts of Asia, where people are very much against migrants, right? But somewhere in between those two kind of extremes, there's also, what happens to the local community when people leave. And so today I want to try and talk a little bit about, what is the experience of El Salvador as a country for the past 40 years has been defined by migration. Even today, about between a quarter and a third of El Salvador's GDP comes from remittance money, money that's sent back to their country of origin by migrants abroad. So obviously, there's an enormous amount of economic aspect to migration, but then also the social fabric that gets torn about. And I think that El Salvador really provides a space for us to reflect on what are some of the positives, some of the negatives about migration, and what is going to occur in the coming years as climate change and other social and ecological crises continue to displace enormous amounts of people as they move away from their countries of origin. In the class summary, briefly, I want to look at the statistics following this UN report that was released in 2024. It's a report that specifically looks at how climate change is going to drastically increase the amount of people who are forced to migrate from their communities of origin. I also want to look at some of the drivers. What is causing exactly this climate related migration? We know that climate change causes a hotter climate, but what exactly is it that is going to be force people away from their communities towards forcing them to move towards other places? And then I think an important thing that often gets overlooked in the migration debate is this idea between international versus internal migration. And I think what we're going to see and what the UN report shows us is that the vast majority of migrants will not be moving across the borders, but within their own countries. So a lot of times we hear, countries like the United States and Europe, and they talk about how hard it is for them to receive so many migrants, that they're this major migrant receiving country. But really, statistically, the countries that receive most migrants are, the country itself. Due to internal displacement, people are forced to move from the countryside to the city, from one area of the country to the other. And the UN report I've referenced it shows that is going to be a trend that continues. And then lastly, I want to look at some of the possible negative scenarios and some possible positive scenarios to this massive amount of migration that is kind of in the works. The UN report is, like I said, it's very somber in the sense that it says that even if we stopped burning fossil fuels today, had a complete transition to renewable energies, made all of the ecological transitions that we need to make, even if we do that, the amount of climate change that's already kind of baked in is especially in the coming 25, 50, 75 years, is going to continue to displace people. So even if we, as a global community, get our act together and are able to change things, there are going to be very real aspects that we're going to have to deal with. So starting with the statistics, in the next 25 years, the International Organization for Migration, which is a dependency of the UN, estimates that 1 billion people will be displaced from their homes due to climate-related events. By the year 2050, we're expected to be a global population of about 10 billion people. So that means 1 in 10, every 1 in 10 people is going to be displaced, whether that be internally or externally or internationally. 10% of the population is going to be displaced due to climate-related events. That includes things like floods, storms, and wildfires. We're already seeing that. That's been a major driver of global human mobility in the past, decades, playing a role in over 26.4 million displacements in 2023 alone. So just 2 years ago, over 26.4 million people had to leave their homes due to fires, due to floods, and other climate-related things that have a direct connection to climate change. In many cases, these have been temporary displacements, right? People are forced to leave their homes due to a flood, and then once the flood water recedes, government and international aid organizations go in to help rebuild, and people try to go back to that. One of the things we're going to see in the coming years is that the migration due to climate-related events is not going to be a temporary movement, rather, a permanent movement. So obviously, we're going to talk about, the example of sea level rise. There are dozens of island nations in the world who are forced to completely abandon their country because it is going to disappear under the seawater, right? The nearly 32 million displacements caused by weather-related hazards in 2022 represents a 41% increase compared to the 2008 levels. So what we're seeing is that as global climate becomes more and more unstable, as climate events become more extreme, people are being forced to move more and more every year. It's increasing on a year-by-year level. In the Caribbean, where I live, the number of Category 5 hurricanes is increasing every year as well. The World Bank estimates that between 44 million and 216 million people will migrate within their countries due to climate change by the year 2050. Obviously, there's a discrepancy between some of the institutional data. Some people talk about a billion people. Others talk about a quarter billion people, 216 billion. But there is an enormous amount of people that are expected to move. As you see here, the vast majority of the movement of people is going to occur in what's called the global south. About 1.6 population of Latin America, 3.5% of the population of sub-Saharan Africa, 1.6 of the population of South Asia, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Obviously, again, this refers to the fact that people in Europe, Northern Asia, and North America are generally expected to have the infrastructure. This is obviously an example of global inequality, the infrastructure that will allow them to respond effectively, to protect their populations. Here's an example. About 2 years ago, I was in Miami for an academic conference, and the local and state government of Florida and the city of Miami has been investing billions of dollars in building seawalls. So essentially huge concrete barriers that's expected to protect the city and, all of the billions of dollars of real estate and homes and businesses from the expected sea rise. Other places in the world, especially in the global south, simply do not have that investment, don't have that money, don't have the infrastructure capability. So whereas the global north is already investing billions of dollars a year to protect themselves from the climate change disruptions, people in the global south do not have those protections. And that, again, is one of the things that's going to force people to move. What are some of the drivers of this climate-related migration? One, seawater rise. this. Assuming no adaptation, there is the risk of displacement between 72 and 187 million people over the next century. That's between 0.9 and 2.4% of the global population. Vanuatu is one small island nation in the Pacific Ocean that they've already started preparing for how to maintain a national government without a physical territory. And it's this really interesting aspect. They've started all of these campaigns about how they can they're uploading a lot of information onto the web, taking pictures of their island, trying to create museums of artifacts of their culture, and they're trying to think about how can we maintain an identity as people from Vanuatu when our island eventually disappears underneath the water. And where are they going to go? There's already discussions with other island nations, with Australia, with New Zealand, about moving. In this case, I think they have hundreds of thousands of people population. That's something that's not reversible. And so that obviously these island nations that have low level that are going to be swallowed by the sea are going to have to move somewhere. The National Institute of Health says that nation states lost to sea rise. Nations, particularly the low-lying atoll nations of the Pacific, like Tuvalu, Kiribati, Fiji, Vanuatu, Solomon Islands, and Samoa, and the Indian Ocean nation of the Maldives, are most at risk of being lost due to rising sea levels. But this isn't only going to affect people, island nation communities. Obviously, around the world, especially in the global south, the vast majority of the global population live very close to sea level in cities, in communities that are directly at the sea. That's been a historical development due to fishing, our dependence on the sea for protein, et cetera, et cetera. And there are billions and billions of people who live in low-lying cities, in cities around the global south, and many of them are going to be drastically affected by sea level rise as the oceans rise, as the glaciers, the icebergs, places in Antarctica begin to melt. Sea level is going to rise, and they're going to have to move inward. Another driver of climate-related migration is simply that it's going to get too hot. Many areas near the equator will become simply too hot to live. Areas of the world projected to become too hot for human habitation by the middle to the end of this century. So between 1250 and 2100, include parts of South Asia, the Persian Gulf, the Red Sea, Eastern China, and Brazil. These regions are especially vulnerable due to their high humidity, which prevents effective sweating, making the combination of heat and humidity lethal even at relatively high air temperatures. Other at-risk areas include the Indus River Valley in India, parts of the Middle East, and potentially Eastern China and the Midwest U.S. with higher global warming scenarios. People displaced by worse storms, droughts, fires, and other climate-related disasters. The Internal Displacement Monitoring Center reporting over 32 million internal displacements due to weather-related hazards in 2022 alone. Floods, storms, and droughts are the primary drivers, with floods being the hazard that displaces the most people, according to the Migration Data Portal. One of the things that's interesting is a lot of times, we see, I recently, earlier this year, went on a trip with my family to the desert of the southwest part of the United States. And the temperatures were up to, in Fahrenheit, it was up to 110 degrees. In Celsius, that's about 45 degrees Celsius. And it was extremely hot, but it was a dry heat, right? It was something where you'd go outside and you'd feel the sun beating down on you, but you didn't necessarily sweat. It was a dry heat, so it was, able to make, it made you, it was bearable, right? Many of the areas around the equator, however, have extremely high humidity, 70, 80, 90% humidity levels. And that's what calls wet bulb temperatures. So it's not necessarily the number on the thermometer, but the combination of high heat combined with high humidity. And there are places in the world where it simply gets too hot for the human body to function. I forget what it is. I think it's called a wet bulb 37 degree or wet bulb 35. So when you get this combination of a temperature above 35 degrees Celsius with, I think it's a 70% relative humidity rating, the human body simply cannot work for extended periods of time. There's a science fiction writer by the name of Kim Stanley Robinson who wrote a really interesting novel, kind of a dystopian novel about climate change in the near future, called the Ministry of the Future, I think is the name of the book. And he starts that book with a heat wave in somewhere in India, where there was an extended wet bulb temperature of 35 degrees that it lasted for 72 hours, where the nighttime temperatures didn't go down. There was such stress on the local energy grid due to the temperature that there was large blackouts. People couldn't go into air conditioned areas, and in this book there was this massive heat wave that killed millions of people over a couple days. And one of the things about these kind of dystopian novels is it's based on very real things that could happen, right? So one of the things that there are many areas in the world where people will only be able to survive during these extended heat waves in air conditioned spaces. And then we have this question whether our energy grid is going to be resilient enough to provide that. What's going to happen if there are large scale blackouts? And this has already occurred in places like Europe, very, very developed places. I think back in 2008, there was a huge heat wave that was said to contribute to the deaths of tens of thousands of people, mostly elderly people who couldn't withstand the heat. The power went off. They weren't able to keep their homes cool enough, and they passed away. And so this is obviously expected to only become more and more serious as time goes along. Another thing, as I mentioned, these are some of the drivers of climate climate change and climate induced refugees. But like I mentioned, one of the things that often gets overlooked is that the vast majority of movement of people is not going to be from poor nations to wealthy nations. Obviously, there's going to be a lot of people trying to, move from Africa to Europe, from Central America and South America to North America. But we are already seeing an extremely, I would say, violent response. We see these kind of right-wing populist nativist movements in Europe, political parties throughout Europe, throughout North America, who are very, very anti-migrant. Donald Trump, with his policy of picking up people and sending people back to their countries of origin has already slowed down the movement, especially of Central and South American people to the United States due to the fear factor of people being picked up, fear of being deported, fear of being sent to jail for an enormous amount of time. And whatever we think of this violent response to migrants is have an effect in slowing the movement of international migration of people from the south to the north. But even if that hadn't happened, the vast majority of movement migrants is in their country of origin, what's known as internal migration. Again, the same report I mentioned, the International Organization of Migration of the UN, estimates that up to 1 billion people in the coming 25 years will be displaced due to climate change related events. Many people and politicians in the global north imagine massive migrant caravans making their way to the borders of the US and Europe. The reality, however, is that around 90% of those displaced people will be internal migrants, those forced to move from their homes to other places within the borders of their country. In this sense, the greatest receiving country of migrants is not the United States or Europe, but the poor nations of the global south, right? This is a graph taken from the report. By 2050, if no action is taken, there will be more than 143 million internal climate migrants across these three regions: Sub-Saharan Africa, Latin America, and South Asia. And like I mentioned, some organizations, up that number to 250 million, other up to 1 billion. I guess it depends. It depends on how you measure the movement of people, right? Um, so where will these internal migrants be moving? What should, for example, the country of El Salvador? We have 6 billion people. 3 billion people have already moved outside of the borders of our country. But of the 6 billion people, at least another 10-20% are going to continue to move within the country. Where will they be going? Right? Many nations should expect to see a massive movement of people away from low-lying coastal areas where people have traditionally lived, right? We mentioned already the issue of sea level rise. Obviously, especially near the equator. Low-lying coastal communities are going to see extreme temperatures. People are going to be moving inland, moving to higher elevations. Another thing that we should see is that most major urban areas developed near the deltas of major rivers due to an abundance of water resources. Over historically, the biggest cities were developed in these areas where big rivers met the ocean. If people are forced to abandon these historic cities, these historically urban areas, due to rising sea levels and heat concerns, access to potable water inland and at higher elevation areas will continue to be a very serious challenge. That's something I think we don't think about. There was a reason that cities generally developed at the deltas, or where these huge rivers emptied into the sea, because one, you had access to protein, and from the case of fishing, and you also had an enormous amount of water, both for irrigating, for farming, and also for to sustain large amounts of people. If these river delta areas where cities have historically developed are threatened by flooding due to sea level rise, or if they get too hot, and as people move inwards, there's going to be an enormous effect on where water is going to come from. The United Nations estimates that over 2 billion people worldwide simply don't have access to safe drinking water today, and roughly half of the world's population is experiencing severe water scarcity for at least part of the year. These numbers are only expected to increase, exacerbated by climate change and population growth, right? 700 million people could be displaced by water scarcity, right? In areas where springs dry up, where rivers, where simply the density of human population creates so much demand for water that there is not enough available, right? The UN Water Report of 2021 says that 72% of all water withdrawals are used by agriculture, 16% by municipalities, and 12% by industries. More than 5 billion people could live in water-stressed regions by 2050. So within the next 25 years, in the next 2.5 decades, over half of the global population is going to live in areas where, at least for part of the year, there's going to be extreme water stress. And the migration of people is going to only contribute to that water scarcity, and that water, and obviously water scarcity leads also into social areas, into civic strife, into water-related wars, etc. Right? Internal migration, the UN report that I mentioned, also expects that it will largely be from rural areas to urban areas, where the metropolitan and urban areas of the global south will be forced to take in millions of climate refugees. We've talked about this in the past. We've talked about the great urbanization of the past 50 or 100 years. If we go back to look at statistics in 1900, about 80% or 85, 90% of the world's population lived in rural areas, lived, close to the land where our food was grown, where our water was sourced, etc. Right? And over, the past 100 years or 150 years of massive industrialization, that led to a profound demographic shift. Whereas, by 2050, we're expected to essentially have flipped those numbers. We'll be between 80 and 90% of the global population will live in densely populated urban areas, and between 10 and 15% will live in rural areas. As global climate change really takes off in the next 25 years, the UN expects that this urbanization will only continue. More people will be forced to leave the rural areas due to water stress, small farmers that simply don't have access to water to irrigate their crops. Global climate change obviously is expected to change weather patterns. So a lot of the traditional agricultural techniques about how people learned to time the harvests, when they should sow, when they should reap, all of these kind of very stable climate patterns are expected to be interrupted. The question I think that we need to ask, especially in these large metropolitan, huge cities throughout the global South and Asia and Latin America, is if these cities, if these urban areas, which are already facing unprecedented growth, will they be able to provide adequate jobs, infrastructure, et cetera, for massively growing populations? I think that's a question that needs to be answered very quickly to try and avoid some of the very negative scenarios that I think are possible due to this, the coming displacement due to global climate change, especially internal displacement of people. So here are some possible negative scenarios. We'll end on a positive note, but we'll get kind of dystopian here for a minute. A couple possible negative scenarios are that one, massive internal migrations due to climate change. We could see what, some people, I don't like this term, but it's called the slumification of many of the largest cities in the global south. The slums are, these very marginalized rural areas, generally on the outsides of the cities, without any basic services. Many of these communities have no access to electricity, no access to running water, no access to sewage systems. The people work as day laborers. They have no job security, no job rights. A lot of times, these areas of these marginalized urban areas are extremely violent. There's gang violence. There's sectarian violence. And there's been a lot of work about how to improve these areas. But if we continue to see an influx of millions of people moving more and more into these cities, excuse me, I think we could see, even more development of slums, of these really marginalized areas that really aren't uh, a great option for people to live healthy, dignified lives. People in these marginalized urban areas would have very little access to basic infrastructure and services, and would continue to exist at the margins of society. The stress on water sources for these growing metropolitan urban areas might lead to even further crises. I don't know if you all remember, but I think it was about 4 or 5 years ago, Johannesburg in South Africa, a major metropolitan area, millions of people, they rely on water from a reservoir. And the reservoir, it didn't rain. There was a huge drought contributed to by global climate change, and the reservoir levels dropped and dropped and dropped. And they got to a point where they were counting down the clock. When the reservoir reached a certain level, it was going to essentially dry up, and the city of millions of people was going to be left without water. And I think they started counting down at 100 days, and they got to about 19. And then finally it rained. It was kind of this moment of being saved by nature. But had the drought continued for their 19 days, there would have been a moment when millions of people in this major metropolitan area would have been left without water. This type of scenario is going to continue. In Central America, where I live, most of the major urban areas depend, at least for a part of the water, on aquifers. So underground water, and those aquifers are rapidly depleting. They're being dropped year by year by year, and they're not being replenished because people are pulling out more water than they can. So what's going to happen to these cities when the amount of potable water that is available to them is dropping every year, but at the same time there are more and more people moving to them. Obviously, the stress on water sources is going to lead to more and more crises, sociological health crises. I would say probably issues of violence and civil strife as well. Internal migrations within countries also could lead to major ethnic, cultural, or linguistic divisions that could also provide a spark for major civil conflicts. You've seen this in many parts of India, where we see, for example, Hindu and Muslim populations who were historically divided, had separate parts of the country, different areas, and now everybody's moving into these urban areas, and they have to try and reconcile, these ethnic religious differences. And lastly, energy shortages, supply chain disruptions, and other unforeseeable disruptions to the global economic system could also cause major crises for the growing urbanized populations living in these marginalized areas, right? If there is an energy crunch, right? A limited amount of energy that's going to be available for our world due to the depletion of fossil fuels, et cetera. Obviously, it's these marginalized urban areas that are going to feel the crush of that more. There's going to be longer and longer blackouts, brownouts, rolling brownouts, many times when there is simply not any energy available. That's already being seen in many parts of the world. For example, Venezuela is a country that has, had enormous disruptions to its energy grid, where large parts of the population have gone, weeks without any access. And in urban areas where it gets extremely hot and people no longer have access to air conditioning, that could be a very, very real and serious issue. And some other possible negative scenarios in an international context, for people who are moving across international borders, we could very well see the continuation and inflaming of anti-migrant sentiment in the global north. More and more of this right-wing pushback, trying to blame migrants for all of their different um, um, challenges, all of the different problems that people are facing, right? Saying that the migrants are the ones who are causing all of the problem, that they're the bane of society. Migrants continue to offer a political scapegoat for politicians wrestling with the unraveling of the global system that is defined modernity. As energy shortages, water shortages, food shortages, as all of these things start to unravel and problems become, the migrants offer, an easy scapegoat. Well, it's the problem of the people who speak a different languages, the brown-skinned people, the black-skinned people, those who come from apart. It's always going to be, the fingers are going to be pointed first at them. In most dystopian novels and movies, right, that talk about, a future wars and dystopian issues, there's always a subplot wherein migrants are being rounded up into camps, deported, etc. And the current political events certainly show that this isn't just, dystopian fiction. It's also a possibility. The recent move of the Donald Trump administration to deport Venezuelan migrants to a for-profit prison in a third country, El Salvador, where I live, this shows that even the most dystopian futures for international migrants are already coming true. In the case of 200 young Venezuelan men, they were accused of being gang members without any sort of real evidence. Instead of being deported back to the country of origin, which is would be a logical response, they were deported to this maximum security prison where they were tortured essentially psychologically and physically, without any access to lawyers, any access to due process, and were only released due to this kind of strange prisoner exchange. This is dystopian. It's something that we're living today, right? Okay, so those are some of the negative possibilities that I think we can expect, unfortunately. What are some positive scenarios that could come about due to the issues related to climate-induced refugees, this massive displacement of people? Despite the very real negative scenarios outlined above, there is also reason to think that there could be a positive outcome to the coming great displacement caused by climate change, climate-induced migration. For example, changing demographics in wealthy nations is already leading many major nations to begin to implement policies to invite migrants into their countries. With an aging population and birth rates well below the replacement rate, wealthy nations are going to see a quick population decline within one generation. And the question remains for these nations, who will pay the bill for the older retired generation to keep the economy going? This graph over here shows the decline of the fertility rate in many wealthy nations. There are some very, very extreme cases, especially in Northern Asia. So the country of South Korea currently has a 0.6 fertility rate, means that for every woman or for every couple, I guess you could say, they're having a 0.6%, 0.6 children are being born to each couple. The replacement rate is 2.1. A little bit over two. Obviously, two people die, a man and a woman die, and if they have two children, then the population remains steady. 2.1 is because there are cases, obviously of children dying. So the replacement rate is 2.1. In some countries, such as Japan, South Korea, certain countries of Northern Europe, so all of the Scandinavian countries, their replacement rate is below one. That means if you take that out over two generations, a population of 100 million people would be reduced to close to 50 million, sorry, close to 25 million people over two generations. That is a massive decline in population. And though we might, many people think that reducing population is a good thing, for countries that have such a quick and massive population decline, the question remains, who's going to keep the economy going? As the baby boomer generation grows older, if you have a population that shrinks by more than 75%, obviously you're not going to have the same economic output to pay for pensions, to pay for health care, to keep the economy going, to essentially maintain basic services. Many wealthy nations, especially in Northern Asia, they've been trying to get their population to have more kids, and it's not working. They've offered credits to try and, have small families have more and more children, and it's not working. And many countries are understanding that the only way they're going to be able to maintain their economy going in the coming generations is through migrants, people moving into South Korea, into Japan, into Northern Europe to keep the economy churning, to allow the aging population to continue to expect the benefits that we have. Um, Population, like I mentioned, population decline in wealthy countries. South Korea, for example, has a birth rate of just 0.72 children per woman, pose serious economic challenges, particularly in aging societies. One man by the name of Jeremy Grantham, who's a leading thinker in this area, um, in the areas of demographic change and migration, he believes that this issue alone, along with the fertility crisis affecting people around the world, will drastically shift future policies on immigration. I went to a conference where Jeremy Grantham was speaking a couple years ago, and he said all of the anti-migrant sentiment that you're hearing, the Donald Trump type of people, the right-wing people in North America who are very, very against the migrant, he said in one generation's time, that's going to entirely flip. And he's very, very confident that, in 25 years, as populations drastically decline in the global north, these countries, he says, are going to be fighting for migrants. So they're going to be implementing certain policies to invite people from the global south, where population numbers are high and where birth rates continue to be higher, to move to these countries. I don't know if he's correct, but that's certainly one kind of interesting aspect to think about. So he says that instead of implementing policies aimed at keeping migrants out, many aging countries will do everything they can to attempt to attract migrants to keep their society and economy functional. So instead of anti-migrant sentiment and hostility, we might be able to imagine a world where migrants were once again welcomed for their contribution to the economic and cultural needs of a place. Nations in need of laborers might drastically expand, for example, temporary migrant worker programs to allow for legal pathways to migration, thus reducing the atrocities of human trafficking. In the small community in El Salvador where I live, there are these what's known as temporary worker programs, where several young men are able to go to the United States to work for 6 months out of the year during the harvests, essentially because in most parts of the United States, there simply are not enough agricultural laborers. Nobody wants to do the work. There's not enough people. The robots and the machines can't do it. And so, farmers, these huge farms of, 10 thousands of acres in certain parts of the country, they need people to go out to come and to help harvest. So what we could see, as the amount of the working population in the global north recedes, they're going to see that we have to develop certain pathways. And instead of forcing people to migrate across borders, here in Central America, all of the migrant pathways are dominated by the drug cartels. There's major issues with human trafficking, sexual trafficking. Many people are lost in the desert. It's a There's atrocious crimes that occur due to illegal migration. What happens along the migrant pathway. So instead of subjecting migrants to these horrible conditions, what happens if countries really get their act together and understand that there is an enormous amount of people who want to work in the global south. There's an enormous need for workers in the global north, and we create very real and good programs to make that a possibility. That might be a little bit, I guess you could say, hopeful, but I think that there's definitely, a need there. And I think that hopefully we're going to see that happen, especially as the demographic shift occurs in the global north. Large cities, another kind of positive scenario could be that large cities in the global south could start right now bolstering their infrastructure, knowing that people are going to continue to move to these urban areas. What could mayors and city governments and state governments in all of these massive urban areas across the global south, what could they do right now to start to boost their own infrastructure? You know, build affordable housing, invest in water infrastructure to make sure that they're going to have enough water resources for an expanded population, how to invest in renewable energy systems right now, how can they prepare to accommodate the millions of eternal refugees expected in the coming years. Right now, that should be the main infrastructure investment of every major urban area across the global south, preparing for the movement of people that's coming, for the water scarcity that's coming. That should be, a primary focus of every city government. Pardon. To make a few conclusions, one of the things that I think is extremely important is that we change the idea of what a migrant is. Obviously, with the Donald Trump administration in power right now, there's this kind of global sentiment, like I mentioned, that the migrant is the bad person, that the migrant is the cause of all of the damages. And I think that we need to obviously challenge that sentiment. Anton Chekhov, who was one of the famous Russian novelists in the 1800s, late 1800s, he experienced an enormous amount of movement of internal migration. Many Russian farmers during his lifetime were forced to move from the countryside into the urban areas. So, kind of what we're experiencing now, has occurred in the past. And one of the things that he says in one of his novels, I think is really interesting. He says, this is a quote from his novel: "To cut loose from a life which seems to be unusually badly, and to sacrifice for this one's own locality, one's beloved domestic nest, can only be done by an exceptional human being, a hero." Right? Human beings are naturally rooted people. We want to live in community, to develop roots, to stay in a place. That's kind of like a natural tendency, I think. And when the conditions are so bad that people are forced to move, I think instead of looking at that person as a criminal, right, as a cause for, a problem, reimagining or rethinking the migrant as a hero, I think, is something that's important, right? So reimagining migrants as heroes is perhaps a necessary exercise in developing empathy for people whose lives are upended or are going to be drastically affected by the global climate change in the coming years. And lastly, and this is an issue that I think doesn't get talked about enough in the whole migrant issue, it's also important, extremely important, to consider the right to stay put, or the rights of those who choose not to migrate. Right. Obviously, you all know that my sentiments lie with rural communities. And I think that one of the things that is often not talked about is that people who live in rural areas, in indigenous communities, in farming communities, these communities also have a right to stay put, a right to not migrate, right? So migration inevitably causes major changes to the cultures and economies of the places that are left behind. When 50% of the young men in a local community, in a local rural community, migrate either to the city or to the United States or whatever, the amount of money that they start to send back, that changes. So the community where I live at, there's an enormous amount of remittance money that comes in from migrants. That's obviously an important part of the economy, but it also causes the value of land, to skyrocket. There's an enormous amount of inflation and speculation with land prices. And what we see essentially is that young men who chose not to migrate are all of a sudden priced out of land. Right, a young man who has a small farm who wishes to purchase, another small plot of land, finds that he can't do it because the only way to make the amount of money needed to purchase another piece of land is to migrate, and that is a stimulus, a force moving people apart. And I think one of the things that people in my community need to discuss is what is the right of the person who stays. How can we regulate the price of land and try to avoid the speculation caused by those who chose to migrate so that others are not forced to migrate as well? In our discussion of how to best respond to the coming great displacement, it is also important to take into consideration the rights of people who never left their places, those who continue to exist in those places despite the profound economic and social changes that migration brings to the home community. So, in the whole dynamic and argument about global climate change and how people are going to be forced to move. I think we also need to ensure that we always think about and consider the rights of those rural people who continue to live and stay, maintain cultures, maintain traditions, and try to think about how their rights can also be respected.